In August 2017, the Martinez family locked their front door and drove away for what should have been a perfect 2-week vacation. Their housekeeper, Madeline Chen, waved from the porch, smiling. She had done this dozens of times before. 2 dogs, a quiet house, nothing unusual. But 6 days later, when the family called to check in, no one answered. When police arrived, they found the dogs starving, the television still on, a half-eaten sandwich on the counter. Maddie's phone, wallet, and car were untouched. There were no signs of a break-in, no footprints, no struggle, no blood. She had simply vanished. For 6 years, the house stood silent, the case went cold, and the questions multiplied. Then, in the summer of 2023, a contractor tore up the backyard deck. What he found beneath it would shatter everything the family thought they knew. August in the suburbs of Minneapolis always arrives with a particular kind of heat, the kind that makes the asphalt shimmer, that pulls families to lakesides and cabins, that marks the final stretch of summer before school buses return and routines resume. For the Martinez family, August 2017 meant their annual pilgrimage north, a tradition they had kept for nearly a decade. Eduardo Martinez, 43 years old, a real estate developer who had built a comfortable life through careful investments and long hours, stood in the driveway that Friday morning, loading suitcases into the back of their SUV. His wife, Celeste, a pediatric nurse, with kind eyes and a perpetual air of calm competence, was inside, doing one last check of the house. Their daughter Sophia, 14 and at that delicate age between childhood and independence, sat in the back seat with her headphones on, scrolling through her phone. Their son Lucas, 9 years old and still young enough to be excited about everything, bounced in his seat, asking every few minutes if they were ready to leave yet. The lakeside cabin in northern Minnesota was modest, but theirs. A place where cell service was spotty, where the nights were cool even in August, where the family could disconnect from the noise of the city and simply exist together. Eduardo had purchased it years ago, before the kids were born, back when he and Celeste were newlyweds dreaming of a future that felt, at the time, impossibly distant. Now that future was here, and it looked like this. A 2-week vacation, s'mores by the fire, early morning fishing trips, Sophia reading on the dock while Lucas splashed in the shallows. But before they could leave, there was the matter of the house. The dogs, 2 golden retrievers named Biscuit and Honey, needed care. The plants needed watering, the mail needed collecting. For the past 8 years, this responsibility had fallen to Madeline Chen, the family's live-in housekeeper. Maddie, as everyone called her, was 52 years old, originally from Taiwan, and had come to the United States in 1998 with little more than a suitcase and a work visa. She had spent years working multiple cleaning jobs, sleeping on couches, saving every dollar she could. She sent money back to her elderly mother in Taipei every month without fail. She attended a small Taiwanese church on the east side of the city once a month, sitting quietly in the back pew, never lingering for coffee hour. She was private, almost to the point of invisibility, but she was also reliable in a way that felt increasingly rare. Eduardo and Celeste had hired her in 2009, shortly after Lucas was born, when Celeste's maternity leave ended and the chaos of 2 working parents with 2 young children became unmanageable. Maddie had answered an ad they posted in a community bulletin. She arrived for the interview with a folder of references, all glowing, all emphasizing the same things: punctual, trustworthy, quiet. She spoke English with a soft accent, her sentences careful and deliberate. She didn't ask for much. A small bedroom on the first floor, meals provided, a modest salary. In return, she kept the house running. She cooked, cleaned, did laundry, picked up the kids from school when Celeste's shifts ran late. She became part of the fabric of their lives, so woven in that her presence was easy to take for granted. The children adored her. She taught Sophia how to fold dumplings, how to braid her hair in intricate patterns. She played card games with Lucas, letting him win just often enough to keep him interested. She never raised her voice, never complained, never asked for time off beyond her one Sunday a month for church. She kept her room tidy, almost Spartan. A neatly made bed, a small bookshelf with Chinese novels and a few English paperbacks, a photo of her mother on the nightstand. She didn't date, didn't socialize, didn't seem to want anything beyond the quiet routine she had built. That Friday morning, as the family prepared to leave, Maddie stood on the front porch in her usual uniform, plain jeans, a pale blue t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. Celeste handed her a list of emergency contacts, the vet's information, and an envelope containing $800 in cash for groceries and any incidentals that might come up. Maddie took it with a small nod, slipping the envelope into her pocket. Eduardo reminded her that they'd be out of cell range for most of the trip, but that she could call the cabin's landline if anything urgent came up. Maddie said she understood. She always understood. Sophia hugged her before getting into the car, a quick squeeze that Maddie returned with a soft pat on the back. Lucas waved enthusiastically from the window. Eduardo started the engine. Celeste took one last look at the house. That instinctive maternal inventory. Doors locked, stove off, everything in order. Maddie stood on the porch, one hand raised in a small wave, her expression calm and untroubled. The SUV pulled out of the driveway, turned the corner, and disappeared down the tree-lined street. It was the last time anyone in the Martinez family would see Madeline Chen alive. The drive north took just over 4 hours. The landscape shifted from suburbs to farmland to forest, the highway narrowing into 2 lanes flanked by towering pines. They arrived at the cabin in the early afternoon, the air cooler and cleaner than the city, the lake glittering in the sunlight. The kids ran down to the dock immediately, testing the water temperature with their hands, shrieking at how cold it was. Eduardo unloaded the car while Celeste opened all the windows, airing out the cabin after months of disuse. It felt like slipping into a familiar rhythm, a script they had performed dozens of times before. That first evening, they grilled burgers on the deck, played board games by lamplight, and went to bed early. The next day, Eduardo and Lucas went fishing at dawn, coming back with a single small bass that Lucas insisted on throwing back. Sophia spent the morning reading in a hammock strung between 2 trees. Celeste made pancakes and coffee, savoring the slowness of it all, the absence of beeping pagers and ringing phones. They didn't think about Maddie, not really, beyond a passing comment from Celeste that she hoped the dogs weren't giving her too much trouble. It was easy not to think about her. Maddie was always fine. Maddie was always there. By the 4th day, that assumption would begin to crack. On Tuesday morning, Celeste tried calling the house. It was a routine check-in, nothing urgent, just a quick conversation to make sure everything was going smoothly. The phone rang and rang, eventually going to voicemail. Celeste left a message asking Maddie to call back when she had a chance. She tried Maddie's cell phone next, same result. Ringing, then voicemail. Celeste frowned but didn't panic. Maybe Maddie was out walking the dogs. Maybe she was at the grocery store. She sent a text. "Hi Maddie, just checking in. Let me know all is well." The message showed as delivered but not read. By Thursday, the unease had sharpened into something harder to dismiss. Celeste had called 4 more times. Eduardo had tried the landline repeatedly. No answer. No returned calls. No texts. Sophia noticed her mother's worry and asked what was wrong. Celeste tried to sound reassuring, saying that Maddie was probably just busy, but her voice carried a tension that Sophia picked up on immediately. Eduardo suggested they cut the vacation short and drive back, but Celeste hesitated. What if they rushed home and Maddie was fine? What if they were overreacting? What if there was a simple explanation, like a dead phone battery or a miscommunication? On Friday, 6 days into the trip, Eduardo made the call that would change everything. He phoned their neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, an elderly widow who lived 3 houses down and had known the family for years. He explained the situation, trying to keep his voice steady, trying not to sound alarmist. Mrs. Kowalski agreed to walk over and check on things. She arrived at the Martinez house 20 minutes later, finding the front door locked, the curtains drawn, the mailbox overflowing. She rang the doorbell. No answer. She knocked. Nothing. But she could hear the dogs inside, barking frantically, a desperate, continuous sound that made her stomach turn. Mrs. Kowalski called the police. The 2 officers who responded to the welfare check arrived at the Martinez house just after noon on that Friday. Officer Jennings, a veteran with over 20 years on the force, and Officer Park, younger and newer, approached the front door with the cautious professionalism that comes from not knowing what they're about to find. Mrs. Kowalski met them on the sidewalk, wringing her hands, explaining that the family was out of town, that the housekeeper was supposed to be watching the house, that no one had heard from her in days. The dogs were still barking, a ragged, exhausted sound that carried through the closed windows. Jennings called Eduardo, who provided the code to the garage door. The officers entered through the garage, stepping into the dim, cool interior of the house. The dogs rushed them immediately, two golden retrievers with matted fur and wild eyes, their water bowls bone dry, their food dishes licked clean. Park knelt down to calm them, speaking in a low voice, while Jennings moved deeper into the house. The kitchen was the first room that struck him as wrong. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the counter, the bread curled and hard, the lettuce browned. A glass of water, still half full, sat beside it. In the living room, the television was on, muted, playing a rerun of some cooking show. The remote sat on the coffee table. A throw blanket was draped over the back of the couch, as if someone had been sitting there recently. Everything looked normal, except for the stillness. The house felt like a photograph, a moment frozen mid-action. Jennings called out, "Hello, police? Anyone home?" His voice echoed through the empty rooms. No response. Park opened the back door and let the dogs out into the yard, where they immediately ran to the fence and relieved themselves, whining. He filled their bowls with food and water from the pantry, and they devoured it with a desperation that confirmed they hadn't been fed in days. Upstairs, Jennings found Maddie's bedroom. The door was open, the bed was made, the corners tucked in with military precision. On the nightstand sat her cell phone, plugged into a charger, the screen dark. Beside it, her wallet, a small brown leather billfold containing her driver's license, a bank card, $32 in cash, and a photo of an elderly woman Jennings assumed was her mother. Her purse hung on a hook on the back of the door. In the top drawer of the dresser, he found her passport, the pages stiff and barely used. In the closet, her clothes hung neatly, organized by type and color. Everything she would need to leave identification, money, phone was still here. Jennings moved to the bathroom. A toothbrush sat in a cup by the sink. A towel hung on the rack, dry. In the washing machine in the basement, he found a load of laundry, damp and beginning to smell of mildew. It had clearly been sitting there for days. In the kitchen, he opened the refrigerator. Fresh groceries, milk, eggs, vegetables, deli meat, nothing spoiled yet, but close. Park met him back in the kitchen. "No sign of forced entry," he said. "All the windows are locked from the inside. Back door was locked, front door was locked, garage door was closed." Jennings nodded slowly. "And her car?" "Still in the driveway." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what they weren't finding pressing down on them. No blood, no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture, no note. Just an empty house and a woman who seemed to have vanished mid-task, mid-meal, mid-life. Jennings called it in. A missing person case. Possible endangered adult. The dispatcher took the information and said a detective would be assigned. In the meantime, Jennings and Park secured the house, took photographs, and waited for the family to arrive. Eduardo and Celeste drove through the night. The 4-hour trip compressed into 3.5 by Eduardo's lead foot and mounting panic. Sophia sat in the back seat, silent and pale, Googling missing persons statistics on her phone. Lucas asked questions no one could answer. When they arrived just after dawn on Saturday, the house was still cordoned off with police tape. A detective named Morris, a man in his 50s with a tired face and a coffee-stained tie, met them in the driveway. He walked them through what had been found, or rather what hadn't been. He asked about Maddie's habits, her routine, her relationships. Eduardo and Celeste answered as best they could, but they realized how little they actually knew. Did Maddie have friends? Not that they were aware of. A boyfriend? She'd never mentioned one. Family in the area? Just her mother overseas. Debts? Not that they knew of. Enemies? The idea seemed absurd. Maddie was the least confrontational person they had ever met. Detective Morris asked if anything was missing from the house. Celeste walked through each room, her hands shaking, checking drawers and closets. Nothing seemed out of place. The $800 Eduardo had left for Maddie was still in the kitchen drawer where she always kept household cash. Her laptop, an old model she used for video calls with her mother, was on the desk in her room, password protected but untouched. The detective asked for Maddie's phone. Jennings handed it over in an evidence bag. Morris scrolled through recent calls and messages. The last outgoing call had been made the Saturday before, 3 days before the family left, to a local grocery store confirming a delivery time. No text sent after that, no social media activity. Her email was mostly spam and a few messages from her church's newsletter distribution list. Morris asked if he could speak to neighbors. Eduardo and Celeste agreed immediately, desperate for answers. Over the next 2 days, Morris and his team canvassed the street. No one had seen Maddie after the family left. No one had heard anything unusual. No cars they didn't recognize. No strangers. A few neighbors had security cameras, but the footage showed nothing. Maddie putting out the trash on Saturday evening, wearing the same jeans and blue shirt, walking back inside. That was the last confirmed sighting. Maddie's car, a 2009 Honda Civic with over 200,000 miles on it, was still in the driveway, covered in a thin layer of pollen. Morris had it towed to the police impound for processing. The interior was clean, almost obsessively so. No fingerprints, except Maddie's. No signs of struggle. Nothing hidden under the seats or in the trunk. By Monday, the case had been elevated. Detectives pulled Maddie's bank records. No withdrawals since the Friday before she disappeared. No credit card activity. Her social security number hadn't been used. They checked hospitals, clinics, homeless shelters. Nothing. They ran her name through national databases. No arrests, no encounters with law enforcement, no hospital admissions, no morgue records. Celeste couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the last conversation she'd had with Maddie, searching for clues she might have missed. Had Maddie seemed upset, distracted, scared? She couldn't remember anything unusual. Eduardo threw himself into coordinating with the police, making calls, printing flyers. Sophia and Lucas stayed with Eduardo's parents, shielded from the worst of it but still absorbing the fear that had settled over their family like ash. On Wednesday, Detective Morris sat down with the family in their living room. He laid out the possibilities. Maddie could have left voluntarily, though nothing about her profile suggested she was a flight risk. She could have had a medical emergency, a stroke or seizure, and wandered off confused, though searches of nearby areas had turned up nothing. She could have been abducted, though there was no evidence of that. Or she could have met with foul play, though, again, there was no evidence. What we have, Morris said carefully, is a woman who seems to have vanished without a trace. No signs of struggle, no obvious motive for leaving, and no leads. Cases like this are incredibly difficult, but we're not giving up. Celeste buried her face in her hands and wept. Eduardo stared at the floor, his jaw clenched. The house, once a place of warmth and routine, now felt haunted by Maddie's absence. Every room held a memory of her. The kitchen where she'd made thousands of meals. The laundry room where she'd folded countless loads of clothes. The porch where she'd waved goodbye. Detective Morris promised to keep them updated. He left his card on the coffee table. As he walked out, he glanced back at the house, at the neat lawn and the drawn curtains and the quiet street. Somewhere, he thought, there was an answer. But it wasn't here. In the days following Maddie's disappearance, the investigation expanded outward like ripples in water. Detective Morris and his partner, a younger detective named Ramos, worked methodically through every angle they could think of. They pulled Maddie's phone records and went through them line by line. Her call history was sparse, mostly incoming calls from Celeste or Eduardo, a few calls to the grocery store, one call to her church, and weekly calls to an international number in Taipei that belonged to her mother. The last call to Taiwan had been 2 Sundays before she vanished. Her mother, reached through a translator arranged by the Taiwanese consulate, was frantic. She said Maddie called every Sunday at the same time, 9 in the morning Minnesota time, which was late evening in Taipei. The call had never been missed in 15 years. When Maddie didn't call that first Sunday after the Martinez family left, her mother had been worried. When she didn't call the second Sunday, she had been terrified. She had tried calling Maddie's cell phone dozens of times, leaving voicemails in Mandarin, begging her daughter to call back. The translator conveyed the mother's questions. Was Maddie in trouble? Had she been hurt? Was she in the hospital? Morris had to tell her, as gently as possible through the language barrier, that they didn't know. The mother began to cry, a sound that carried through the phone line with such raw grief that even Ramos, who prided himself on professional detachment, had to look away. Morris and Ramos interviewed the Martinez family again, this time separately, in a small room at the police station. It was standard procedure, and Eduardo and Celeste understood that, but it still felt like a violation. Eduardo answered every question with increasing frustration. No, he hadn't been having an affair. No, there were no financial problems. No, he had never mistreated Maddie. Yes, he could provide phone records, credit card statements, anything they needed. Celeste was more composed, but equally exhausted. She described Maddie as quiet, dependable, almost invisible. She admitted, with shame in her voice, that she didn't know much about Maddie's personal life. They had never asked, and Maddie had never volunteered. It had seemed like a respectful boundary at the time. Now it felt like a failure. Morris asked if there had been any incidents recently. Missing money, arguments, anything unusual. Celeste paused, then mentioned that a few months earlier, Eduardo had noticed that some cash he kept in his office drawer had gone missing. $200. They had wondered if Maddie had taken it, but Eduardo had dismissed it, saying he might have spent it and forgotten. They hadn't confronted her. It had seemed too small, too uncertain. Morris made a note but didn't press further. $200 wasn't much of a motive for anything. The detectives reached out to the church Maddie attended, a small congregation that met in a rented community center. The pastor, an elderly man named Reverend Lou, confirmed that Maddie came sporadically, maybe once or twice a month. She sat in the back, sang the hymns quietly, and left before the social hour. She had never joined any committees, never attended Bible study, never asked for help. Reverend Lou said he had tried to engage her in conversation a few times, asking about her life, but she had always deflected, offering polite smiles and vague answers. He got the sense she was lonely but didn't know how to reach her. Morris and Ramos interviewed other members of the congregation. A few remembered Maddie, but no one knew her well. One woman said Maddie had once mentioned her mother in Taiwan, saying she hoped to visit someday but couldn't afford the trip. Another said Maddie always brought homemade dumplings to the church potlucks, but she never stayed to eat. She would drop off the food and leave. It was a portrait of a woman who existed on the margins, who passed through spaces without leaving much of an impression. The detectives expanded their search. They checked bus stations, train stations, and the airport. No records of Maddie Chen purchasing a ticket or boarding any form of public transportation. They checked rideshare companies. No trips logged to or from the Martinez address. They checked taxi companies. Nothing. They pulled surveillance footage from nearby businesses, gas stations, convenience stores. Hours of grainy footage yielded nothing useful. Maddie, it seemed, had not left the house by any conventional means. Search and rescue teams were deployed. Volunteers and cadaver dogs combed nearby parks, wooded areas, and the riverbanks. The theory was that Maddie might have had a medical emergency, a stroke, a fall, a sudden mental health crisis, and wandered off, disoriented. But day after day, the searches came up empty. No clothing, no personal items, no trace of her. The dogs alerted a few times, but each alert turned out to be a false positive. An animal carcass, old trash, nothing human. The local news picked up the story. A reporter from a Twin Cities station did a segment titled, "Beloved Housekeeper Vanishes Without a Trace." They showed a photo of Maddie, one that Celeste had provided from a family birthday party 2 years earlier. In the photo, Maddie stood in the background, slightly out of focus, holding a cake. It was one of the only photos the family had of her. She had always avoided cameras. The segment aired on a Thursday evening, and by Friday morning, the police tip line was flooded. People claimed to have seen Maddie at a grocery store in St. Cloud, at a bus stop in Duluth, at a homeless shelter in Milwaukee. Each tip was followed up. Each one led nowhere. Some were honest mistakes, someone who resembled Maddie from a distance. Others were cruel hoaxes, people seeking attention or a reward that didn't exist. Weeks turned into months. The initial surge of urgency began to fade, replaced by the grinding reality of a cold case in progress. Eduardo and Celeste hired a private investigator, a retired detective named Tom Hargrove, who specialized in missing persons cases. Hargrove was thorough and professional, but even he found nothing new. He retraced the police investigation, interviewed the same people, reviewed the same footage. He told the family, gently, that without new evidence, there was little anyone could do. Maddie had become a ghost. The flyers that had been stapled to telephone poles and taped to storefront windows began to fade and peel. The neighborhood, which had been briefly galvanized by the mystery, moved on. New families moved into houses on the street. Halloween came and went, then Thanksgiving, then Christmas. The Martinez family went through the motions of the holidays, but everything felt hollow. Sophia, now 15, spent hours reading about missing persons cases online, trying to find patterns, trying to make sense of what had happened. Lucas, now 10, still had nightmares. He dreamed of Maddie calling for help, her voice muffled and distant, and him not being able to find her. By the spring of 2018, the case was officially cold. Detective Morris retired in June, handing off his caseload to a new detective named Yolanda Reyes. Reyes inherited a filing cabinet full of unsolved cases, and Maddie's was just one folder among many. She reviewed it periodically, looking for something the others had missed, but the file was maddeningly thin. No forensic evidence, no witnesses, no motive, just a woman who had been there one moment and gone the next. Celeste couldn't bring herself to enter Maddie's room. It sat untouched, the bed still made, the photo of Maddie's mother still on the nightstand. Eduardo suggested they pack up her things, donate them, move on, but Celeste refused. It felt like giving up, like erasing Maddie from existence. So the room remained a shrine to a woman who had vanished. In the fall of 2019, the family held a small memorial service at Maddie's church. There was no body, no burial, just a gathering of people who had known her, however briefly. Reverend Lou led the service, speaking about faith and hope and the mystery of God's plan. Celeste read a letter she had written to Maddie, apologizing for not knowing her better, for not asking more questions, for not being there when she needed help. Sophia played a song on the piano, something Maddie had taught her years ago. Lucas sat in the front row, silent, his face unreadable. The service ended, and people filtered out into the parking lot, offering condolences and hugs that felt inadequate. Eduardo stood by the car, staring at the gray sky, wondering if Maddie was out there somewhere, alive and lost, or if she was gone forever. There was no way to know, and that not knowing, that vast and terrible absence of answers, was a weight he would carry for the rest of his life. In Taiwan, Maddie's mother passed away in the spring of 2020, her health destroyed by grief and age. She died never knowing what had happened to her daughter, never getting to say goodbye. The news reached Celeste through a contact at the consulate. She wept for hours. For Maddie, for her mother, for the cruelty of a world where people could just disappear. The years passed slowly. The case remained open but inactive. Detective Reyes checked in occasionally, but there was nothing new to report. The Martinez house, once filled with noise and life, felt different now, quieter, haunted. And somewhere, in the back of their minds, the family couldn't help but wonder, where was Maddie? What had happened to her? And would they ever know? The first year after Maddie's disappearance was the hardest. The second year was no easier, just different. By the third year, the Martinez family had learned to function around the hole her absence had left, the way a tree grows around a wound in its bark. Life went on, because it had to, but it was forever marked by what had been lost. Celeste threw herself into her work at the hospital, picking up extra shifts, volunteering for the hardest cases. She told herself it was about helping others, but Eduardo knew the truth. She was running from the guilt. She blamed herself for leaving, for not checking in sooner, for not knowing Maddie well enough to see warning signs that, in hindsight, might not have even existed. At night, she lay awake, replaying every interaction, every conversation, searching for clues. She found none, but she kept searching anyway. Eduardo dealt with it differently. He became obsessed with control, with making sure nothing else could go wrong. He installed a state-of-the-art security system in the house, with cameras covering every angle, motion sensors on every door and window. He checked the locks compulsively before bed, sometimes multiple times. He kept spreadsheets of the family's schedules, tracking everyone's whereabouts. Sophia and Lucas found it suffocating, but they understood. Their father was terrified of losing anyone else. Sophia, now 16, channeled her confusion and fear into true crime podcasts and YouTube documentaries. She listened to stories of missing people, of cold cases, of families who waited decades for answers. She became an armchair detective, scrolling through forums, reading theories, trying to understand how someone could vanish so completely. Her friends found it morbid, but Sophia couldn't stop. She felt like if she could solve someone else's mystery, maybe it would bring her closer to understanding Maddie's. Lucas, quieter and more withdrawn, processed it differently. He didn't talk about Maddie much, but he thought about her constantly. He remembered the way she used to make him hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, the way she'd let him help her fold laundry, the way she'd smile when he showed her a drawing he'd made. He had nightmares often, always the same. Someone dragging Maddie away while he watched, unable to move or scream. He'd wake up gasping, and Eduardo or Celeste would sit with him until he fell back asleep. The school counselor said it was trauma, that time would help. Lucas wasn't so sure. The house itself felt different. The family never hired another live-in housekeeper. Celeste hired a cleaning service that came once a week, but it wasn't the same. The house felt emptier, colder. Maddie's room remained untouched, the door closed but not locked. Sometimes Celeste would stand in the doorway, looking at the neatly made bed, the books on the shelf, the photo of Maddie's mother. She kept telling herself she would pack it up eventually, donate the clothes, clear out the space. But every time she tried, she couldn't bring herself to do it. It felt too final, too much like erasing Maddie entirely. In 2019, 2 years after the disappearance, the family held the memorial service. It helped a little. It gave them a moment to acknowledge the loss, to say the things they hadn't been able to say. But it didn't bring closure. How could it? There was no body, no grave, no definitive end. Maddie was gone, but she wasn't dead, at least not officially. She existed in a liminal space, neither here nor there, and the family was trapped in that space with her. Detective Yolanda Reyes, who had taken over the case when Morris retired, did her best. She wasn't the original investigator, but she cared. Every few months, she'd pull the file and review it, looking for something new. She'd call Celeste occasionally just to check in, to let her know the case hadn't been forgotten. Celeste appreciated it, but the calls were always the same. No new leads, no updates, no progress. The case was cold, and it was getting colder. By 2020, the world had other crises to deal with. The pandemic hit, and suddenly everyone was locked in their homes, fearful and isolated. The Martinez family, already fractured, struggled to hold together. Eduardo worked from home, his office door closed for hours on end. Celeste picked up grueling shifts at the hospital, coming home exhausted and distant. Sophia and Lucas attended school online, their screens replacing classrooms and friends. The house, once a place of warmth, felt more like a tomb. Sophia graduated high school in 2021, a small ceremony on the front lawn with masks and social distancing. She had been accepted to the University of Minnesota, planning to study criminal justice. She told her parents she wanted to help people like Maddie, people who fell through the cracks. Celeste hugged her tightly, proud and heartbroken at the same time. Lucas, now 13, spent most of his time in his room, drawing and listening to music. He didn't talk much anymore. Eduardo worried about him but didn't know how to reach him. In the spring of 2022, Celeste finally made a decision. She told Eduardo she wanted to sell the house. She couldn't live there anymore, surrounded by memories of Maddie, of the life they'd had before. Eduardo resisted at first, but eventually he agreed. The house had become a prison, a constant reminder of loss. They needed to move on, even if they didn't know how. The neighborhood, once so familiar, felt alien now. New families had moved in, people who didn't know about Maddie, who didn't ask questions. The Martinez family had become the sad story people whispered about, the cautionary tale parents told their kids. The family kept to themselves, avoided eye contact, stopped attending block parties. They were ghosts in their own neighborhood. By the time they decided to sell, it was the summer of 2023. 6 years had passed since Maddie disappeared. The case was still technically open, but no one was actively working on it. Detective Reyes had been reassigned to a different unit. The file sat in a storage room somewhere, gathering dust. Maddie's face was still on missing persons websites, but the views had dwindled to almost nothing. She had become a statistic, a cold case, a mystery with no solution. Eduardo hired a real estate agent, a woman named Karen who was efficient and unsentimental. She walked through the house, taking notes, suggesting minor renovations to increase the sale price. Update the kitchen, refinish the basement, replace the old deck in the backyard. Eduardo agreed to all of it. He just wanted it done, wanted to move on, wanted to stop living in the past. Karen recommended a contractor, a man named Ray Booker, who ran a small but reliable renovation company. Ray came by to give an estimate, a friendly guy in his 50s with a weathered face and a firm handshake. He said the work would take about a month, maybe less. Eduardo signed the contract without hesitation. They were so close to leaving, to starting over. Just a few more weeks, and the house would be someone else's problem. Ray and his crew started work in late July, tearing into the kitchen first, then moving to the basement. The final item on the list was the deck. It was old, built in the early 2000s, the wood warped and splitting. Ray said it would be easier to tear it down and rebuild than to try to repair it. Eduardo agreed. On a sweltering afternoon in early August, Ray and his assistant began dismantling the deck. Neither of them had any idea that, beneath their feet, they were about to uncover the answer to a 6-year-old mystery. The summer of 2023 was brutal, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and the asphalt soft underfoot. Ray Booker and his assistant, a younger man named Danny, had been working on the Martinez house for 3 weeks, and the deck was the last item on the punch list. It was a large structure, elevated about 4 feet off the ground, with a lattice skirting that wrapped around the perimeter. The wood was rotting in places, gray and splintered, and Ray had told Eduardo it was a teardown. No sense trying to salvage it. Easier to start fresh. They began on a Tuesday morning, the sun already high and unforgiving. Danny pried up the deck boards one by one, tossing them into a pile near the driveway. Ray worked on the support beams, using a reciprocating saw to cut through the bolts that held everything together. The noise was loud and grating, and the sawdust mixed with the sweat on their arms. By midday, they had removed most of the deck, leaving only the lattice skirting and the bare ground beneath. Ray knelt down and peered into the crawlspace under where the deck had been. It was dim and dusty, the kind of space you'd expect to find cobwebs and maybe a forgotten rake. But something caught his eye. The soil looked disturbed, uneven. There was a slight depression in one area, as if the ground had settled over something. Ray frowned. He grabbed a flashlight from his tool belt and shone it into the space. That's when he smelled it. It was faint, almost sweet, but unmistakable if you knew what you were smelling. Ray had been in construction for 30 years. He'd worked on enough old houses, torn down enough walls, to know what decomposition smelled like. He felt his stomach tighten. He called Danny over. "You smell that?" Ray asked, his voice low. Danny leaned in, then pulled back, his face pale. "Yeah, what is that?" Ray didn't answer. He pulled away a section of the lattice skirting, the thin wooden panels coming loose easily. The smell grew stronger. He shone the flashlight deeper into the crawl space, moving the beam slowly across the dirt. And then he saw it. Fabric. Faded and stained, but definitely fabric. A corner of what looked like a tarp, partially buried in the soil, and next to it something else, a shoe. Brown, leather, small. And beyond that, in the dim edges of the flashlight beam, something pale and curved, bone. Ray stood up so fast he nearly fell. His heart was pounding. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. He turned to Danny. "Don't touch anything. Go call 911, right now." Danny didn't need to be told twice. He ran to his truck, fumbling for his phone. Ray stood there, breathing hard, staring at the crawl space. His mind was racing. How long had it been there? Who was it? Did the family know? He thought about Eduardo, the quiet man who'd hired him, who'd seemed so eager to get the house sold. Had he known? Ray didn't want to believe it, but he couldn't shake the thought. The police arrived within 10 minutes. First a patrol car, then another, then an unmarked sedan, detectives, crime scene techs. By the time an hour had passed, the backyard was a hive of activity. Yellow tape cordoned off the area. Neighbors started to gather on the sidewalk, craning their necks, whispering. Ray and Danny were separated and interviewed by different officers. Ray explained what they'd been doing, what he'd seen, what he'd smelled. The officer taking notes had a grim expression. Detective Yolanda Reyes arrived just after 2 in the afternoon. She had been in a meeting downtown when the call came through. The address had sounded familiar, and when she heard the details, her blood ran cold. The Martinez house. She pulled the file on her laptop before she even left the station. Madeleine Chen, missing since August 2017. 6 years. Reyes stood at the edge of the yard, watching the forensic team carefully excavate the area under the deck. They worked slowly, methodically, photographing every step. One of the techs, a woman named Dr. Patel, knelt in the dirt with gloved hands, brushing away soil. She uncovered more of the tarp than the bedsheet beneath it. The fabric was floral, faded pink and white. She carefully peeled it back, revealing what lay inside. It was a body, partially decomposed, skeletal in places, mummified in others. The clothing was still intact, jeans, a pale blue t-shirt. Dr. Patel worked carefully, exposing the skull. The back of it was fractured, a clear indentation where something heavy had struck. She looked up at Reyes and nodded. Homicide. Reyes felt a wave of nausea mixed with vindication. She had known, deep down, that Maddie hadn't just walked away, but finding the body here, in the backyard of the house she'd been living in, was almost incomprehensible. How had they missed it? How had search teams, cadaver dogs, investigators, how had they all missed this? The answer was simple and infuriating. No one had thought to look under the deck. Why would they? There were no signs of digging, no disturbance visible from above. The lattice skirting had hidden everything, and the deck had been there for years, installed long before Maddie's disappearance. It was the perfect hiding place because it was so mundane, so ordinary. No one looked twice at a backyard deck. Reyes called Eduardo immediately. He was at work, in a meeting, when his phone rang. She told him they'd found remains. She said they were running identification tests, but that they believed it was Maddie. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Eduardo asked, in a voice that didn't sound like his own, where they'd found her. Under the deck, Reyes said. In your backyard. Eduardo dropped the phone. Celeste was at the hospital when Eduardo called her. She didn't remember driving home. She didn't remember parking. She just remembered standing in the street, behind the police tape, staring at her house. The house she'd lived in for 15 years. The house where she'd raised her children, where she'd celebrated birthdays and holidays, where she'd grilled dinners on that deck dozens of times. Maddie had been there, right there, the whole time. Sophia and Lucas were picked up from school by Eduardo's brother. They were told that evening, in the living room of their uncle's house. Sophia didn't cry. She just sat there, staring at the wall, her face blank. Lucas asked in a small voice if Maddie had been there when they played in the backyard. Eduardo couldn't answer. He just held his son and tried not to fall apart. The dental records and DNA testing took 48 hours. On Thursday afternoon, Dr. Patel called Reyes with the confirmation. The remains were Madeleine Chen. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Time of death: approximately 6 years prior, consistent with the timeline of her disappearance. The news broke that evening. Local stations ran the story as breaking news. Body found in missing housekeeper case. The Martinez house was on every screen, the backyard cordoned off, forensic tents visible. Reporters camped out on the street, interviewing neighbors, speculating wildly. The family's phones were flooded with calls, journalists, distant relatives, strangers. Eduardo and Celeste turned them all off. The revelation shattered what little equilibrium they'd managed to build. For 6 years, they'd lived with uncertainty, with the faint hope that maybe Maddie was alive somewhere, that maybe she'd come back. Now that hope was gone, replaced by something worse: the knowledge that she had been dead the entire time, buried beneath their feet. Every barbecue, every summer evening, every time the kids had played in the yard, Maddie had been there. It was a horror beyond comprehension. Reyes stood in the backyard the next morning, after the body had been removed and the forensic team had packed up. She looked at the empty space where the deck had been, at the disturbed soil, at the house beyond. She thought about Maddie, about her life, about the fact that she'd died alone and afraid, and then been hidden away like trash. She thought about the family, about the years they'd spent not knowing, and the years they'd now spend knowing too much. And she thought about the person who had done this. Because the body hadn't buried itself. Someone had killed Maddie, wrapped her in a tarp and a bedsheet, dragged her under the deck, and covered her up. Someone had walked away and let the family suffer for 6 years. Someone had let an old woman in Taiwan die without ever knowing what happened to her daughter. Reyes pulled out her phone and called her captain. "We're reopening this case," she said. "Full investigation. I want everyone who had access to that house. Contractors, delivery drivers, landscapers, everyone. Whoever did this is still out there, and I'm going to find them." The case, cold for 6 years, was suddenly the hottest thing in the department. And this time, Reyes wasn't going to let it go cold again. The forensic analysis moved quickly. Dr. Patel and her team worked around the clock, processing every piece of evidence recovered from the site. The body, the tarp, the bedsheet, the soil samples, everything was cataloged and examined. The skull fracture was measured and photographed. Dr. Patel determined it was consistent with a single, powerful blow from a blunt object. There were no defensive wounds on the bones, no fractures to the hands or arms that might suggest Maddie had tried to fight back. That meant she'd been taken by surprise, struck from behind before she even knew what was happening. The tarp was old, generic, the kind you could buy at any hardware store. No serial numbers, no distinguishing marks. But the bedsheet was different. It was floral, with a pattern of faded pink and white roses. Celeste was brought in to look at it, and she confirmed, through tears, that it had belonged to their household. It was from a set of old linens they'd stored in the basement, ones they no longer used. Whoever had wrapped Maddie's body had taken it from inside the house. Detective Reyes and her team began the painstaking process of building a timeline. They knew Maddie had been alive on Saturday, August 12th, 2017, because the neighbor's security camera had captured her taking out the trash that evening. The Martinez family had left on Friday, August 11th. The family had tried calling Maddie starting on Tuesday, August 15th, and found no response. The medical examiner estimated time of death as within 24 to 48 hours after the family left, which meant Maddie had died sometime between Saturday evening and Monday afternoon. That was a narrow window. Reyes re-interviewed Eduardo and Celeste, this time with the knowledge that Maddie had been killed on their property. The interviews were painful but necessary. Eduardo provided his phone records, credit card statements, and a detailed account of their vacation. He and Celeste had been at the cabin in northern Minnesota, 300 miles away with their kids. There were receipts for gas, groceries, and meals at local restaurants. There were photos time-stamped from their phones. There were witness statements from the cabin's neighbors, who remembered seeing the family. The alibi was airtight. The family was cleared quickly and definitively. But someone had been at the house. Someone had killed Maddie, wrapped her body, and buried her under the deck. Reyes pulled records for everyone who had had access to the property in the months leading up to Maddie's death. The list was long. Landscapers, pool cleaners, HVAC technicians, delivery drivers, contractors. Reyes and her team started calling them in for interviews, one by one. Most were easy to eliminate. The landscaping crew worked in teams and had alibis for each other. The pool cleaner was a woman in her 60s who'd been with the company for 30 years. The HVAC tech had been in Florida visiting family the week Maddie disappeared. But there was one name that kept coming up, one person who'd had significant access to the property: Marcus Holt. Marcus was a handyman who'd done odd jobs for the Martinez family sporadically from 2015 to 2017. He'd installed shelving in the garage, repaired a fence, fixed a leaky faucet, and in June 2017, just 2 months before Maddie disappeared, he'd replaced the lattice skirting around the deck. It was that lattice that had hidden Maddie's body for 6 years. Reyes pulled Marcus's file. He was 34 at the time of Maddie's disappearance, now 40. He'd had a few run-ins with the law in his 20s: petty theft, disorderly conduct, but nothing recent. He'd listed a local address on his contractor's license, but when Reyes sent a patrol car to check, the house was occupied by a different family. They said Marcus had moved out in early 2018, not long after Maddie vanished. They didn't know where he'd gone. Reyes ran his social security number. It had been used to file taxes in 2017 and 2018, but then it went dark. No tax returns, no employment records, no address changes. It was as if Marcus Holt had disappeared too. But Reyes knew people didn't just vanish, not really. They left traces. She ran his name through national databases, checking for driver's licenses, utility bills, anything. And then she found it. In Ohio, in a small town outside of Cleveland, A man named Marcus Hall had applied for a driver's license in 2019. The photo matched. It was Marcus Holt, living under a slightly different name. Reyes felt a surge of adrenaline. She called the Ohio State Police and requested assistance. Within hours, they had Marcus's current address, a small apartment above a laundromat. He was working at a warehouse, loading trucks, using the name Marcus Hall. Reyes flew to Ohio the next day with Detective Morris, who'd come out of retirement specifically for this case. They arrived at the apartment at 6 in the morning, backed up by local police. Marcus answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, bleary-eyed and confused. When Reyes identified herself and asked him to come in for questioning, his face went pale. He didn't resist. He just nodded and got dressed. At the police station, Reyes and Morris sat across from Marcus in a small interrogation room. They read him his rights. He said he didn't need a lawyer, that he'd answer their questions. Reyes started slow, asking about his work for the Martinez family, about the jobs he'd done. Marcus answered calmly, describing the fence repair, the shelving, the deck lattice. He seemed relaxed, almost casual. But when Reyes mentioned Maddie's name, his expression changed. "Do you remember Madeline Chen?" Reyes asked. Marcus hesitated. "The housekeeper?" "Yes, I remember her. Quiet lady. Kept to herself. Did you interact with her much?" "Not really. She'd let me in when I showed up for a job. Sometimes she'd offer me water or something. That was about it." Reyes leaned forward. "When was the last time you saw her?" Marcus looked down at his hands. "I don't know. Probably the last time I worked there. June, maybe? When I did the lattice." "You didn't go back after that?" "No." Reyes let the silence stretch. Marcus shifted in his seat. Then she said, "We found her, Marcus. We found Maddie. She was buried under the deck you worked on, the deck with the lattice you installed." Marcus's face went white. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. I don't know anything about that." Reyes pulled out a photo of the scene, of the tarp and the bedsheet and the bones. She slid it across the table. Marcus looked at it and then looked away. His jaw clenched. "I didn't do anything," he said. Morris spoke for the first time, his voice calm and measured. "Marcus, we know you were there. We know you had access to the house. We know you installed the lattice that hid her body. We're going to find the evidence that ties you to this. It's only a matter of time. So if you want to tell us your side of the story, now's the time." Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he started to talk. He said he'd been at the house on Saturday, August 12th, the day after the family left. He'd forgotten a drill in the garage, and he needed it for another job. He'd driven over in the morning to pick it up. Maddie was home. She let him in. He went to the garage, grabbed his drill, and was about to leave when Maddie stopped him. She accused him of stealing cash from the house. $200 that had gone missing a few months earlier. Marcus said he had taken it. He'd been broke, behind on rent, and the cash had been sitting in a drawer in Eduardo's office. He'd thought no one would notice, but Maddie had noticed. She'd been keeping track. She told him she was going to call Eduardo, that she was going to tell the family what he'd done. Marcus panicked. He didn't want to lose his reputation, his livelihood. He tried to talk her out of it, but she wouldn't listen. She was calm, almost cold, and she said she'd already decided. Marcus said he didn't remember making the decision to hit her. He just remembered grabbing a flashlight from the workbench in the garage, a heavy metal one, and swinging it. He hit her on the back of the head. She fell. He checked for a pulse. There wasn't one. Marcus said he stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. He didn't know what to do. He was terrified. He thought about calling 911, but he knew he'd go to prison. So, he made a decision. He found a tarp in the garage and a bedsheet in the basement. He wrapped Maddie's body and dragged it outside. He remembered the crawl space under the deck, the space he'd worked in when he'd installed the lattice. It was hidden, dark, accessible. He shoved the body into the space, covered it with dirt, and replaced the lattice panels. It took him less than an hour. Then he left, and he never came back. He said he'd changed his name and moved to Ohio because he couldn't live with what he'd done. He thought about turning himself in, but the longer he waited, the harder it became. He told himself that maybe the body would never be found, that maybe he could live with the guilt. But he couldn't. He said he hadn't slept through the night in 6 years. Reyes listened to the confession, recording every word. When Marcus finished, she asked if he'd sign a written statement. He said yes. Morris left the room and returned with a forensic kit. They took DNA samples, fingerprints, photos. Then they arrested him and charged him with second-degree murder. The evidence came together quickly after that. DNA under Maddie's fingernails matched Marcus. Fibers from the tarp matched materials found in his old work truck, which had been sold but was tracked down and processed. Phone records showed he'd been in the area the day Maddie died. It was an airtight case. Reyes called the Martinez family with the news. Eduardo answered. She told him they'd made an arrest, that the person responsible was in custody. She told him it was Marcus Holt. Eduardo didn't recognize the name at first, and then he did. The handyman, the guy who'd fixed their fence, who'd smiled and joked and seemed so normal. Eduardo felt sick. The family was informed that they'd likely be called to testify at the trial. Celeste asked if they'd have to see him, and Reyes said yes, probably. Celeste started crying. Sophia, listening on speakerphone, asked why. Why had he killed her? Why had he left her there? Reyes said she didn't have all the answers, but she'd find out. The case broke in the media. Marcus Holt's mugshot was on every news site, every broadcast. The story had everything. A missing housekeeper, a 6-year mystery, a body hidden in plain sight, a killer caught. Reporters called it shocking, tragic, a cautionary tale. The Martinez family refused all interview requests. They just wanted it to be over. But it wasn't over. Not yet. There was still the trial, and the weight of testifying, and the knowledge that Maddie had died because of $200 and a moment of panic. It wasn't a grand conspiracy or a calculated murder. It was banal, stupid, and senseless. And somehow that made it even worse. The trial began in the spring of 2024, nearly 7 years after Maddie's death. It was held in a downtown courtroom, wood-paneled and solemn, with rows of benches that filled quickly each day with reporters, curious onlookers, and the few people who had known Maddie. The Martinez family attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row behind the prosecutor's table. Eduardo wore a suit, his face drawn and gray. Celeste sat beside him, hands folded tightly in her lap. Sophia, now 21, and studying criminal justice at the university, took notes in a small journal. Lucas, 15, sat silent and still, staring at the back of Marcus Holt's head. Marcus's defense attorney argued that it had been a tragic accident, a moment of panic, not premeditated murder. He emphasized Marcus's remorse, his confession, his cooperation with the investigation. But the prosecution, led by a sharp and relentless assistant district attorney named Monica Tran, painted a different picture. She argued that Marcus had made a series of choices: the choice to steal, the choice to strike Maddie, the choice to hide her body, the choice to flee and change his identity. Those were not the actions of a man who'd made a mistake. Those were the actions of a man who valued his own freedom over a woman's life. The forensic evidence was damning. Dr. Patel testified about the skull fracture, the force required to cause it, the fact that Maddie had died quickly. Detective Reyes testified about the investigation, the 6 years of searching, the moment the body was discovered. Eduardo testified about hiring Marcus, about trusting him with their home, about the $200 that had gone missing. His voice broke when he described the moment Reyes called to tell him Maddie's body had been found under their deck. Celeste testified about Maddie's character, her reliability, her kindness. She cried on the stand and several jurors looked away. Sophia was called to testify about her memories of Maddie, about what she'd meant to the family. She read from a prepared statement, her voice steady but her hands shaking. She called Maddie the woman who had raised her when her parents were busy, who had taught her how to fold dumplings, who had never missed her birthday. She said Maddie had been invisible to most people, but she hadn't been invisible to Sophia. She said Maddie deserved to be remembered, to be more than just a victim. When she finished, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of Celeste sobbing. Lucas was asked to testify, but he couldn't. The prosecutor said it was okay, that they had enough. But Lucas wanted to. He stood up, walked to the witness stand, and sat down. The judge asked if he was ready. Lucas nodded. Then he looked directly at Marcus Holt, the first time he'd made eye contact with him during the trial. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "She used to make me hot chocolate every night before bed, with extra marshmallows, and she'd sit with me until I fell asleep, because I was scared of the dark." He paused. "I'm still scared of the dark, because of you." Marcus looked down at the table, his face unreadable. The defense attorney objected, saying the statement wasn't a question, but the judge overruled. She said Lucas could say whatever he needed to say. Lucas nodded, said, "That's all," and walked back to his seat. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Marcus Holt guilty of second-degree murder. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later. Monica Tran argued for the maximum sentence, emphasizing the cruelty of hiding Maddie's body, the years of suffering inflicted on her family. Marcus's attorney asked for leniency, citing his client's remorse and cooperation. The judge, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, listened to both sides. Then she sentenced Marcus to 30 years to life in prison. As the bailiff led Marcus out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he glanced back at the Martinez family. Eduardo stared at him, his face hard. Celeste looked away. Sophia met his gaze and didn't blink. Lucas didn't look up. And then Marcus was gone, and the family was left sitting in the silent courtroom. The trial over, but the grief still raw. After the conviction, Maddie's body was finally released. The family arranged for her to be cremated. They couldn't afford to send her entire body back to Taiwan, and her mother was already gone, so they decided to split the ashes. Half were sent to Taipei, to be buried in the plot next to her mother's grave. The family arranged it through the consulate, and a small service was held there by members of Maddie's mother's church. The other half of the ashes remained in Minnesota. The family took them to a park Maddie had loved, a quiet place with a pond and walking trails. Celeste remembered Maddie mentioning it once, saying she liked to sit by the water and read on her days off. They scattered the ashes on a calm afternoon in late spring, when the trees were green and the air smelled of flowers. Eduardo said a few words, thanking Maddie for the years she'd given them, for her care and her quiet strength. Celeste apologized again for not knowing her better, for not protecting her. Sophia read a poem she'd written about invisible people and the marks they leave. Lucas didn't speak. He just stood at the edge of the pond, watching the ashes drift across the water. A few months later, the family commissioned a small plaque to be placed near the pond. It read, "Madeline Chen, 1965, 2017. Beloved friend, caretaker, and quiet soul. You are not forgotten." They visited it once before they left Minnesota for good, placing flowers at its base and standing in silence for a long time. The house was sold in the summer of 2024. The new owners were a young couple with no children, no knowledge of what had happened there. Eduardo hadn't disclosed the history legally. He didn't have to, since the crime hadn't occurred inside the house itself. The couple tore down what remained of the deck and planted a garden in its place, filling it with flowers and vegetables. They had no idea what had been buried there, and Eduardo was glad. Let it be a garden, he thought. Let something grow there. The Martinez family moved to Colorado, to a town neither of them had ever been to, where no one knew their story. They bought a smaller house, a ranch-style place with no deck, no basement, no dark corners. Celeste cut back her hours at the hospital and started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma. Eduardo sold his real estate business and took a job with a firm that didn't require him to make decisions about homes and families. Sophia finished her degree and started working with a nonprofit that helped families of homicide victims. Lucas, quieter than ever, threw himself into art, drawing and painting in a small studio Eduardo set up for him in the garage. But the scars remained. Celeste still had nightmares, dreams where she was back in the old house, searching for Maddie, calling her name, but never finding her. Eduardo still checked the locks compulsively, still tracked everyone's whereabouts, still couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was always just around the corner. Sophia threw herself into her work, helping others because she couldn't help Maddie. And Lucas, now 16, kept a shoebox under his bed filled with letters he wrote to Maddie, letters he'd never send because there was no address for the dead. He wrote about school, about his art, about the things he wished he could tell her. He wrote that he missed her. He wrote that he was sorry. He wrote that he hoped wherever she wasn't alone anymore. The case was closed. Justice, in the legal sense, had been served. Marcus Holt was in prison, where he would remain for decades. The family had answers, Finally, after 6 years of not knowing, but answers didn't equal peace. Knowing what had happened didn't erase the horror of how close she'd been all along, didn't undo the years of searching, didn't bring Maddie back. On quiet evenings, when the house was still and everyone was asleep, Eduardo would sometimes think about the old backyard. He'd think about the summer barbecues, the kids playing on the grass, the dog running circles around the deck, and he'd think about Maddie, just feet away, in the dark, while they laughed and ate and lived their lives. The proximity of it haunted him, the normalcy of it, the way death had been hidden beneath something so ordinary, so mundane. Celeste thought about it differently. She thought about the day they'd said goodbye, the way Maddie had waved from the porch, the last image of her alive and whole. She thought about all the things she should have asked, should have noticed, should have done. And she thought about Maddie's mother, dying without answers, and the cruelty of a world where people could vanish and no one would know why. Sophia thought about systems and gaps, about how someone like Maddie could fall through so many cracks. She thought about all the missing people, the cold cases, the families still waiting for answers. And she worked harder, hoping that maybe, somehow, she could keep someone else from enduring what her family had. Lucas didn't think in words, he thought in images. He drew pictures of Maddie, from memory, trying to capture the way she'd looked when she smiled, when she'd handed him hot chocolate, when she'd waved goodbye. He drew pictures of the old house, the deck, the backyard. He drew pictures of gardens, of flowers growing, where dark things had been buried. He didn't show them to anyone. They were just for him, a way to process what couldn't be spoken. The story, in the end, wasn't a triumph. Justice had been served, but Maddie was still gone. The family had answers, but they were answers that only deepened the wound. They learned to live with it, the way people learn to live with scars that never fully heal. They moved forward, because that's what people do. But they never forgot, and they never stopped asking, in the quiet moments, how something so terrible could have been hidden so close for so long. The weight of what was buried, both the body and the grief, was something they would carry for the rest of their lives. And in that weight, in that unshakable heaviness, Maddie was remembered. Not as a victim, not as a cold case, but as a woman who had lived, who had mattered, who had been loved. And in remembering, they kept her from disappearing entirely, because in the end, that was all they could do.